But thou hast been dearly bought. So is King Alfonso made to sum up the praises of this princely town, with the losses which he had sustained in making himself master of it. I looked on it with something of the same feelings, and I may adopt the same train of thought when I recall Lady Northampton, Lady Abercorn, and other friends much beloved, who have met their death in or near the city. January. January 5 went by invitation to wait upon a priest who almost rivals my fighting Bishop of Malta. He is the old Bishop of Tarentum, and notwithstanding his age 80 and upwards, is still a most interesting man, a face formed to express an interest in whatever passes, caressing manners, and a total absence of that rigid stiffness, which hardens the heart of the old, and converts them into a sort of petrifaction, apparently. His foible was a fondness for cats, one of them. A superb brindled Persian cat is a great beauty, and seems a particular favorite. I think we would have got on well together if he could have spoken English, or I French or Latin. But Hella's, I once saw at Lord Yarmouth's house a Persian cat, but not quite so fine as that of the bishop. He gave me a Latin devotional poem and an engraving of himself, and I came home about 2 o'clock. January 6 to 12. We reached the 12th January amusing ourselves, as we can generally see in company, and taking airings in the forenoon in this fine country, Sir William Gell, a very pleasant man, one of my chief cicerones. Lord Hertford comes to Naples. I am glad to keep up an old acquaintance made in the days of George Roman, for he has got a breed from Maida of which I gave him a puppy. There was a great crowd at the palazzo, which all persons attended, being the king's birthday. The apartments are magnificent, and the various kinds of persons who came to pay court were splendid. I went with the boys, as Brigadier General of the Archers' Guard wore a very decent green uniform laced at the cuffs and pantaloons, and looked as well as 60 could make it out, when sworded and feathered comme il faut. I passed well enough, very much afraid of a fall on the slippery floor, but escaped that disgrace. The ceremony was very long. I was introduced to many distinguished persons, and but for the want of language got on well enough. The king spoke to me about 5 minutes, of which I hardly understood 5 words. I answered him in a speech of the same length, and ill be bound equally unintelligible. We made the general keton of the harangue, la belle langue, et le beau seal of sa majest, very fine dresses, very many diamonds. A pretty Spanish ambassadress, Countess de Costa, and her husband saw the Countess de Lebzeltern, who has made our acquaintance, and seems to be very clever. I will endeavor to see her again. Introduced to another Russian countess of the diplomacy. Got from court about 2 o'clock. I should have mentioned that I had a letter from Skene, and one from Cadle, dated as far back as 2d December, a monstrous time ago, which yet puts a period to my anxiety. I have written to Cadle for particulars and supplies, and besides, have written a great many pages of the siege of Malta, which I think will succeed. January 1623, I think 200 a month or thereby will do very well, and it is no great advance. Another piece of intelligence was certainly to be expected, but now it has come afflicts us much. Poor Johnny Lockhart, the boy, is gone, whom we have made so much of. I could not have borne it better than I now do, and I might have borne it much worse. I went one evening to the opera, to see that amusement in its birthplace, which is now so widely received over Europe. The opera house is superb, but can seldom be quite full on this night. However, it was the guard citizens, and all persons dependent on the court, or having anything to win or lose by it, are expected to take places liberally, and applaud with spirit. The king bowed much on entrance, and was received in a popular manner, which he has no doubt deserved, having relaxed many of his father's violent persecutions against the liberals, made in some degree an amnesty, and employed many of this character. He has made efforts to lessen his expenses, but then he deals in military affairs, and that swallows up his savings, and heaven only knows whether he will bring Neapolitans to fight, which the martinet system alone will never do. His health is undermined by epileptic fits, which with his great corpulence make men throw their thoughts on his brother Prince Charles. It is a pity the king is only 22 years old. The opera bustled off without any remarkable music, and so far as I understand the language, no poetry. And except the Cudille, which was magnificent, it was poor work. It was on the subject of Constantine and Crispus, marvelous good matter. I assure you I came home at 9:30, without waiting the ballet, but I was dog-sick of the whole of it. Went to the Studage today. I had no answer to my memorial to the Minister of the Interior, which it seems is necessary to make any copies from the old romances. I find it is an affair of state, and monsieur can only hope it will be granted in 2 or 3 days. A man that may leave Naples tomorrow. He offers me a loan of what books I need, annals included. But this is also a delay of 2 or 3 days, I think. Really, the Italian men of letters do not know the use of time made by those of other places. But I must have patience in the course of my return home. I called by advice of my valet de place at a bookseller's, where he said all the great messieurs went for books. It had very little the air of a place of such resort, being kept in a garret above a coach-house. Here some 20 or 30 odd volumes were produced by an old woman, but nothing that was mercantile, so I left them for Lorenzo's learned friends. And yet I was sorry too, for the lady who showed them to me was very civil and understanding, that I was the famous chevalier carried her kindness, as far as I could desire. The Italians understand nothing of being in a hurry, but perhaps it is their way. January 24, the king grants the favor asked to be perfect, I should have the books out of the room. But this seems to hurt Monsieur de Lectires, as he kind and civil as he is would hardly allow me to take my labors out of the studage, where there are hosts of idlers and echoes and askers, and no understanders of askers. I progress, however. As the Americans say, I have found that Sir William Gell's amanuensis is at present disengaged, and that he is quite the man for copying the romances, which is a plain black letter of 1377, at the cheap and easy rate of 3 quatrons a day. I am ashamed at the lowness of the remuneration. But it will dine him capitally with a share of a bottle of wine, or by Our Lady, a whole one if he likes it. And thrice the sum would hardly do that in England, but we dawdle. And that there is no avoiding. I have found another object in the studate language of Naples. Janie 25, one work in this dialect, for such it is, was described to me, as a history of ancient Neapolitan legends quite in my way. And it proves to be a dumpy fat 12mo edition of Mother Goose's Tales, with my old friend's Puss in Boots Bluebeard, and almost the whole stock of this very collection. If this be the original of this charming book, it is very curious, for it shows the right of Naples to the authorship. But there are French editions, very early also, for there are two whether French or Italian, I am uncertain off different dates, both having claims to the original edition, each omitting some tales which the other has. To what common original we are to refer them, the Lord knows. I will look into this very closely. And if this same copiator is worth his ears, he can help me. My friend Mr. Roman 500 will aid me, but I doubt he hardly likes my familiarity with the department of letters, in which he has such an extensive and valuable charge. Yet he is very kind and civil, and promises me the loan of a Neapolitan vocabulary, which will set me up for the attack upon Mother Goose spirit of Tom Thumb. Assist me, I could, I think, make a neat thing of this obnoxious to ridicule. Perhaps what? Then the author of Ma Sir Anne was a clever man, and his tale will remain popular in spite of all jibes and flouts. Suever so vamos Karachi. If it was not for the trifling and dawdling peculiar to this country, I should have time enough, but their trifling with time is the devil. I will try to engage Mr. Gell in 2 researches in his way, and more in mine, namely, the Andrea Ferrara and the bonnet piece. Mr. Capel Craven says Andrea de Ferraras are frequent in Italy, plenty to do, if we had alert assistance. But Gell and Lang Meeson have both their own matters to puzzle out, and why should they mind my affairs? The weather is very cold, and I am the reverse of the idiot boy. For as my body's growing worse, my mind is growing better. Of this I am distinctly sensible, and thank God that the mist attending this whoreson apoplexy is wearing off. I went to the Studage and copied Bevis of Hampton, about 2 pages for a pattern, from thence to Sir William Gell, and made an appointment at the Studage with his writer tomorrow at 10, when I trust I shall find de Lectires there. But the gentleman with the classical name is rather kind and friendly in his neighbor's behalf. January 26, this day arrived for the first time indeed answer to last post end of December an epistle from Cadle full of good tidings, Castle Dangerous, and Sir Robert of Paris neither, of whom I deemed seaworthy, have performed 2 voyages that is each sold about 3,400. And the same of the current year. It proves what I have thought almost impossible, that I might write myself out, but as yet my spell holds fast. I have besides 2 or 3 good things on which I may advance with spirit, and with palmy hopes on the part of Cadle and myself. He thinks he will soon cry Victoria on the bed about his hat. He was to get a new one, when I had paid off all my debts. I can hardly, now that I am assured all is well again, form an idea to myself that I could think it was otherwise. And yet I think it is the public that are mad for passing those 2 volumes, but I will not be the first to cry them down in the market, for I have others in hand which, judged with equal favor, will make fortunes of themselves. Let me see what I have on the stocks. Castle Dangerous, supposed future editions, 1,000. Robert of Paris, 1,000. Lady Louisa Stuart 500. Knights of Malta 2500. Tricosian Reliquy 2500. I have returned to my old hopes, and think of giving Milne an offer for his estate. Letters or Tour of Paul in 3 vols 3000. Reprint of Bevis of Hampton for Roxburgh Club. Essay on the Neapolitan dialect. February 10, we went to Pompeii today, a large party, all disposed to enjoy the sight in this fine, whether we had Sir Frederick and Lady Adam Sir William Gell, the coryphus of our party, who played his part, very well Miss de la Ferronnays, daughter of Monsieur le Duc de la Ferronnays, the head I believe of the constitutional royalists very popular in France, and likely to be called back to the ministry, with 2 or 3 other ladies, particularly Mrs. Ashley born Miss Bailey, very pretty indeed and lives in the same house. The Countess de la Ferronnays has a great deal of talent, both musical and dramatic. February 16, Sir William Gell called and took me out tonight to a bookseller, whose stock was worth looking over. We saw among the old buildings of the city an ancient palace called the Vicaria, which is changed into a prison. Then a new palace was honored with royal residence, instead of the old dungeon. I saw also a fine arch called the Capuan Gate, formerly one of the city towers, and a very pretty one. We advanced to see the ruins of a palace, said to be a habitation of Queen Joan, and where she put her lovers to death chiefly by potions thence, into a well smothering them, etc., and other little tenderly trifling matters of gallantry. March embarked on an excursion to Paestum with Sir William Gell and Mr. Langmeason. In order to see the fine ruins we went out by Pompeii, which we had visited before, and which fully maintains its character, as one of the most striking pieces of antiquity, where the furniture, treasure, and household are preserved in the excavated houses, just as found by the laborers appointed by government. The inside of the apartments is adorned with curious paintings, if I may call them such. In mosaic, a meeting between Darius and Alexander, is remarkably fine. A street called the Street of Tombs reaches a considerable way out of the city, having been flanked by tombs on each side, as the law directed the entrance into the town, affords an interesting picture of the private life of the Romans. We came next to the vestiges of Herculaneum, which is destroyed like Pompeii but by the lava or molten stone, which cannot be removed, whereas the tufa, or volcanic ashes, can be with ease removed from Pompeii, which it has filled up lightly. After having refreshed in a cottage in the desolate town, we proceed on our journey eastward, flanked by one set of heights, stretching from Vesuvius and forming a prolongation of that famous mountain. Another chain of mountains seems to intersect our course in an opposite direction, and descends upon the town of Castellamare, different from the range of heights, which is prolonged from Vesuvius. This second, which runs to Castellamare, is entirely composed of granite, and as is always the case with mountains of this formation, betrays no trace of volcanic agency. Its range was indeed broken and split up into specimens of rocks, of most romantic appearance and great variety, displaying granite rock as the principal part of its composition. The country on which these hills border is remarkable for its powers of vegetation, and produces vast groves of vine, elm, chestnut, and similar trees, which grow when stuck in by cuttings. The vines produce Lacrima Christi in great quantities, not a bad wine, though the stranger requires to be used to it. The seashore of the Bay of Naples forms the boundary, on the right of the country through which our journey lies, and we continue to approach to the granite chain of eminences, which stretch before us as if to bar our passage. As we advance to meet the great barrier of cliffs, a feature becomes opposed to us of a very pronounced character, which seems qualified to interrupt our progress. A road leading straight across the branch of hills is carried up the steepest part of the mountain, ascending by a succession of zigzags which the French laid by scale, straight up the hill. The tower is situated upon an artificial eminence, worked to a point, and placed in a defensible position between 2 hills about the same height, the access to which the defenders of the pass could effectually prohibit. Sir William Gell, whose knowledge of the antiquities of this country is extremely remarkable, acquainted us with the history. In the Middle Ages, the pasturages on the slope of these hills, especially on the other side, belonged to the rich Republic of Amiens, who built this tower as an exploratory gazebo, from which they could watch the motions of the Saracens, who were wont to annoy them with plundering excursions. But after this fastness was built, the people of Amalfi usually defeated and chastised them. The ride over the opposite side of the mountain was described as so uncommonly pleasant as made me long to ride it with assistance of a pony that however was impossible. We arrived at a country house near a large town, situated in a ravine or hollow, which was called La Cava from some concavities which it exhibited. We were received by Miss White, an English lady, who is settled at La Cava, and she afforded us the warmest hospitality that is consistent with a sadly cold, chilling house. They may say what they like of the fine climate of Naples unquestionably, they cannot say too much in its favor. But yet when a day or two of cold weather does come the inhabitants are without the means of parrying the temporary inclemency, which even a Scotsman would scorn to submit to however warm or cold to bed we went. And rising next morning at 7, we left La Cava, and making something like a sharp turn backwards, but keeping nearer to the Gulf of Salerno than in yesterday's journey and nearer to its shore, we had a good road towards Paestum. And in defiance of a cold, drizzling day, we went on at a round pace. The country through which we traveled was wooded and stocked with wild animals towards the fall of the hills, and we saw at a nearer distance a large swampy plain pastured by a singularly bizarre but fierce-looking buffalo, though it might maintain a much preferable stock. This palace of Barranco was anciently kept up for the king's sport, but any young man having a certain degree of interest is allowed to share in the chase, which it is no longer an object to preserve. The guest, however, if he shoots a deer, or a buffalo or wild boar, must pay the keeper at a certain fixed price, not much above its price in the market, which a sportsman would hardly think above its worth for game of his own killing. The town of Salerno is a beautiful seaport town, and it is as it were wrapped in an Italian cloak hanging round the limbs, or to speak common sense, the new streets which they are rebuilding. We made no stop at Salerno, but continued to traverse the great plain of that name within sight of the sea, which is chiefly pastured by that queer-looking brute, the buffalo, concerning which they have a notion that it returns its value sooner, and with less expense of feeding than any other animal. At length we came to two streams which join their forces, and would seem to flow across the plain to the bottom of the hills. One, however, flows so flat as almost scarcely to move, and sinking into a kind of stagnant pool, is swallowed up by the earth without proceeding any further until, after remaining buried for 2 or 3 miles underground, it again bursts forth to the light, and resumes its course. When we crossed this stream by a bridge which they are now repairing, we entered a spacious plain, very like that which we had left, and displaying a similar rough and savage cultivation. Here savage herds were under the guardianship of shepherds, as wild as they were themselves, clothed in a species of sheepskins, and carrying a sharp spear with which they herd and sometimes kill their buffaloes. Their farmhouses are in very poor order and with every mark of poverty, and they have the character of being moved to dishonesty by anything like opportunity of this. There was a fatal instance, but so well avenged that it is not like to be repeated till it has long faded out of memory. The story, I am assured, happened exactly as follows. A certain Mr. Hunt, lately married to a lady of his own age, and seeming to have had what is too often the Englishman's characteristic of more money than wit, arrived at Naples a year or two ago, en famille and desirous of seeing all the sights in the vicinity of this celebrated place, among others Paestum, was not forgot at one of the poor farmhouses, where they stopped. The inhabitant set her eyes on a toilet apparatus which was composed of silver, and had the appearance of great value. The woman who spread this report addressed herself to a youth who had been under arms, and undoubtedly he and his companions showed no more hesitation than the person with whom the idea had originated. 5 fellows not known before this time for any particular evil agreed to rob the English gentleman of the treasure of which he had made such an imprudent display. They were attacked by the banditti in several parties, but the principal attack was directed to Mr. Hunt's carriage. A servant of that gentleman being, as well as himself, pulled out of the carriage, and watched by those who had undertaken to conduct this bad deed, the man who had been the soldier, probably to keep up his courage, began to bully talk violently, and strike the valet de place, who screamed out in a plaintive manner, "Do not injure me." His master, hoping to make some impression, said, "Do not hurt my servant," to which the principal brigand replied, "If he dares to resist, shoot him." The man who stood over Mr. Hunt, unfortunately, took the captain at the word, and his shot mortally wounded the unfortunate gentleman and his wife, who both died next day at our landlady's. Miss White, who had the charity to receive them, that they might hear their own language on their deathbed. The Neapolitan government made the most uncommon exertions. The whole of the assassins were taken within a fortnight, and executed within a week afterwards in this wild spot, rendered unpleasing by the sad remembrance of so inhuman an accident, and the cottages which served for refuge for so wretched and wild a people exist. The celebrated ruins of Paestum being without arms of any kind, the situation was a dreary one, and though I can scarce expect now to defend myself effectually, yet the presence of a legible would have been an infinite cordial. The ruins are of very great antiquity, which for a very long time has not been suspected, as it was never supposed that the Sybarites, a luxurious people, were early possessed of a style of architecture simple, chaste, and inconceivably grand, which was lost before the time of Augustus, who is said by Suetonius to have undertaken a journey on purpose to visit these remains of an architecture, the most simple and massive of which Italy at least has any other. Specimen. The Greeks have specimens of the same kind, but they are composed not of stone like Paestum, but of marble. All this has been a discovery of recent date. The ruins, which exist without exhibiting much demolition, are three in number. The first is a temple of immense size, having a portico of the largest columns of the most awful species of classic architecture. The roof, which was composed of immense stones, was destroyed, but there are remains of the cella contrived for the sacrifices, to which the priests and persons of high office were alone admitted. A piece of architecture more massive without being cumbrous or heavy was never invented by a mason. A second temple in the same style was dedicated to Ceres, as the large one was to Neptune, on whose dominion they looked, and who was the tutelar deity of Paestum, and so called from one of his Greek names. The fane of Ceres is finished with the greatest accuracy and beauty of proportion and taste, and in looking upon it, I forgot all the unpleasant feelings which at first oppressed me. The third was not a temple, but a basilica or species of townhouse, as it was called, having a third row of pillars running up the middle between the two which surrounded the sides, and were common to the basilica and temple. Both these surprising public edifices have therefore all a resemblance to each other, though also points of distinction. If Sir William Gell makes clear his theory, he will throw a most precious light on the origin of civilization, proving that the sciences have not sprung at once into light and life, but rose gradually with extreme purity, and continued to be practiced best by those who first invented them. Full of these reflections, we returned to our hospitable Miss White in a drizzling evening, but unassassinated, and our hearts completely filled with the magnificence of what we had seen. Miss White had in the meanwhile, by her interest at La Trinita, with the abbot, obtained us permission to pay a visit to him, and an invitation, indeed, to dinner which only the weather and the health of Sir William Gell and myself prevented our accepting. After breakfast, therefore, on the 18th of March, we set out for the convent, situated about 2 or 3 miles from the town, in a very large ravine, not unlike the bed of the Roslin River, and traversed by roads which, from their steepness and precipitancy, are not at all laudable. But the views were beautiful and changing incessantly, while the spring advancing was spreading her green mantle over rock and tree, and making that beautiful which was lately a blighted and sterile thicket. The convent of Trinita itself holds a most superb situation on the projection of an ample rock. It is a large edifice, but not a handsome one. The monks, reserving their magnificence for their churches, but was surrounded by a circuit of fortifications, which, when there was need, were manned by the vassals of the convent in the style of the feudal system. This was in some degree the case at the present day. The abbot, a gentlemanlike and respectable-looking man, attended by several of his monks, received us with the greatest politeness, and conducted us to the building, where we saw two great sculptured vases, or more properly sarcophagi of marble, well carved in the antique style, and adorned with the story of Meleager. They were in the shape of a large bath, and found, I think, at Paestum the old church had passed to decay about 100 years ago, when the present fabric was built. It is very beautifully arranged and worthy of the place, which is eminently beautiful, and of the community, who are Benedictines, most gentlemanlike order in the Roman Church. We were conducted to the private repertory of the chapel, which contains a number of interesting deeds, granted by sovereigns of the Grecian, Norman, and even Saracen descent. One, from Roger, King of Sicily, extended his Majesty's protection to some half-dozen men of consequence, whose names attested their Saracenism. In all the society I have been since I commenced this tour, I chiefly regretted on the present occasion the not having refreshed my Italian for the purpose of conversation. I should like to have conversed with the churchmen very much, and they seem to have the same inclination, but it is too late to be thought of. Though I could read Italian well, once the church might boast of a grand organ, with 57 stops, all which we heard played by the ingenious organist. We then returned to Miss White's for the evening, ate a mighty dinner, and battled cold weather as we might. In further remarks on Paestum, I may say there is a city wall in wonderful preservation, one of the gates of which is partly entire, and displays the figure of a siren under the architrave. But the antiquity of the sculpture is doubted. though not that of the inner part of the Gatiso at least, thinks Sir William our best authority on such matters. Many antiquities have been, and many more probably will be discovered. Pistum is a place which adds dignity to the peddling trade of the ordinary antiquarian. March 19 this morning, we set off at 7 for Naples. We observed remains of an aqueduct in a narrow, apparently designed for the purpose of leading water to La Cava, but had no time to conjecture on the subject, and took our road back to Pompeii, and passed through two towns of the same name, Nocera dei Cristiani and Nocera dei Pagani. In the latter village the Saracens obtained a place of refuge, from which it takes the name. It is also said that the circumstance is kept in memory by the complexion and features of this second Nocera, which are peculiarly of the African cast and tincture, after we passed Pompeii, where the continued severity of the weather did not permit us, according to our purpose, to take another survey. We saw in the adjacent village between us and Portici the scene of two assassinations still kept in remembrance. The one, I believe, was from the motive of plunder. The head of the assassin was set up, after his execution, upon a pillar which still exists, and it remained till the skull rotted to pieces. The other was a story less in the common style, and of a more interesting character, a farmer of an easy fortune, and who might be supposed to leave to his daughter, a very pretty girl, and an only child, a fortune thought in the village very considerable. She was under the hope of sharing such a prize made up to by a young man in the neighborhood, handsome, active, and of a very good general character. He was of that sort of person who are generally successful among women, and the girl was supposed to have encouraged his addresses, but her father, on being applied to, gave him a direct and positive refusal. The gallant resolved to continue his addresses in hopes of overcoming this obstacle by his perseverance, but the father's opposition seemed only to increase by the lover's pertinacity. At length, as the father walked one evening smoking his pipe upon the terrace before his door, the lover unhappily passed by, and struck with the instant thought that the obstacle to the happiness of his life was now entirely in his own power, he rushed upon the father, pierced him with 3 mortal stabs of his knife, and killed him dead on the spot, and made his escape to the mountains. What was most remarkable was that he was protected against the police, who went, as was their duty, in quest of him, by the inhabitants of the neighborhood, who afforded him both shelter and such food as he required, looking on him less as a willful criminal than an unfortunate man who had been surprised by a strong and almost irresistible temptation. So congenial at this moment is the love of vengeance to an Italian bosom, and though chastised in general by severe punishment, so much are criminals sympathized with by the community. March 20, I went with Miss Talbot and Mr. Lushington and his sister to the great and celebrated church of San Domenico Maggiore, which is the most august of the Dominican churches. They once possessed 18 shrines in this part of Naples. It contains the tomb of St. Thomas Aquinas, and also the tombs of the royal family which remain in the vestry. There are some large boxes covered with yellow velvet which contain their remains, and which stand ranged on a species of shelf, formed by the heads of a set of oaken presses which contain the vestments of the monks. The pictures of the kings are hung above their respective boxes, containing their bones, without any other means of preserving them. At the bottom of the lofty and narrow room is the celebrated Marquis di Pescara, one of Charles Roman V's most renowned generals, who commanded at the Battle of Pavia. The church itself is very large and extremely handsome, with many fine marble tombs, in a very good style of architecture. The time being now nearly the second week in Lent, the church was full of worshippers. While at Naples, Sir Walter wrote frequently to his daughter, to Mr. Cadle, Mr. Laidlaw, and Mr. Lockhart. The latter says some of these letters were of a very melancholy cast, for the dream about his debts being all settled was occasionally broken. One may be given here, it is undated, but was written some time after receiving the news of the death of his little grandson, and shows the tender relations which existed between Sir Walter and his son-in-law. My dear Lockhart, I have written with such regularity that I will not recur to this painful subject, I hope. Also, I have found you both persuaded that the best thing you can do, both of you, is to come out here, where you would find an inestimable source of amusement, many pleasant people, and living in very peaceful and easy society. I wrote you a full account of my own matters, but I have now more complete information. I am ashamed, for the first time in my life, of the 2 novels, but since the pensive public have taken them, there is no more to be said but to eat my pudding and to hold my tongue. Another thing of great interest requires to be specially mentioned. You may remember a work in which our dear and accomplished friend Lady Louisa condescended to take an oar, and which she has handled most admirably. It is a supposed set of extracts relative to James Roman VI, from a collection in James Roman VI's time, the costume admirably preserved, and like the fashionable wigs more natural than one's own hair, this with the lives of the novelists, and some other fragments of my wreck when ashore in constables and were sold off to the highest bidder, viz. To Cadle for himself, and me. I wrote one or two fragments in the same style, which I wish should according to original intention appear without a name, and were they fairly lightly let off there is no fear of their making a blaze. I sent the whole packet either to yourself or Cadle with the request. The copy which I conclude is in your hands. By the time this reaches you might be set up as speedily and quietly as possible, taking some little care to draw the public attention to you, and consulting Lady Louisa about the proofs. The fun is that our excellent friend had forgot the whole affair, till I reminded her of her kindness, and was somewhat inclined, like Lady Teazle, to deny the butler and the coach horse. I have no doubt, however, she will be disposed to bring the matter to an end. The mode of publication, I fancy you will agree, should rest with Cadle, so providing that the copy come to hand, which it usually does though not very regularly, you will do me the kindness to get it out. My story of Malta will be with you by the time you have finished the letters, and if it succeeds it will, in a great measure, enable me to attain the long projected and very desirable object of clearing me from all old encumbrances, and expiring as rich a man as I could desire in my own freehold. And when you recollect that this has been wrought out in 6 years, the sum amounting to at least 120,000, it is somewhat of a novelty in literature. I shall be as happy and rich as I please for the last days of my life, and play the good papa with my family, without thinking on pounds, shillings, and pence. Cadle, with so fair a prospect before him, is in high spirits, as you will suppose, but I had a most uneasy time from the interruption of our correspondence. However, thank God, it is all as well as I could wish, and a great deal better than I ventured to hope after the siege of Malta. I intend to close the series of Waverley with a poem in the style of the lay, or rather of the Lady of the Lake, to be a LN or final postscript to these tales. The subject is a curious tale of chivalry, belonging to Rhodes. Sir Frederick Adam will give me a cast of a steamboat to visit Greece, and you will come and go with me. We live in a palazzo which with a coach and the supporters thereof does not table included cost 120 or 130 a month, so you will add nothing to our expenses, but give us the great pleasure of assisting you when I fear literary things have a bad time. We will return to Europe through Germany, and see what peradventure we shall behold. I have written repeatedly to you on this subject, for you would really like this country extremely. You cannot tread on it, but you set your foot upon some ancient history, and you cannot make scruple, as it is the same thing, whether you or I are paymaster. My health continues good and bettering. As the Yankees say, I have gotten a choice manuscript of old English romances, left here by Richard, and for which I know I have got a lad can copy them at a shilling a day. The king has granted me liberty to carry it home with me, which is very good-natured. I expect to secure something for the Roxburgh Club. Our posts begin to get more regular, I hope, dear. Baby is getting better of its accident. Poor soul, love to Sophia and Walter. Your affectionate father, Walter Scott. April 15, Naples. I am on the eve of leaving Naples, after a residence of 3 or 4 months, my strength strongly returning, though the weather has been very uncertain. What with the interruption occasioned by the cholera and other inconveniences, I have not done much. I have sent home only the letters by Roman 50 Stuart, and 3 volumes of the Siege of Malta. I sent them by Lord Cowper's son Mr. Cowper, returning his leave, being outanned 2 chests of books by the Messrs. Turner Malta, who are to put them on board a vessel to be forwarded to Mr. Cadle through Whitaker. I have hopes they will come to hand safe. I have bought a small closing carriage warranted new. An English cost me 200 for the convenience of returning home. It carries Anne Charles and the 2 servants, and we start tomorrow morning for Rome, after which we shall be starting homeward, for the Greek scheme is blown up, as Sir Frederick Adam is said to be going to Madras, so he will be unable to send a frigate as promised. I have spent on the expenses of medical persons and books, etc., a large sum, yet not excessive. Meantime we may have to add a curious journey of it. The brigands, of whom there are so many stories, are afloat once more, and many carriages stopped. A curious and popular work would be a history of these ruffians. Washington Irving has attempted something of the kind, but the person attempting this should be an Italian perfectly acquainted with his country character and manners. Mr. R. an apothecary, told me a singular occurrence which happened in Calabria about 6 years ago, and which I may set down just now as coming from a respectable authority, though I do not vouch it. Death of Il Bizarro. This man was called from his wily but inexorable temper Bizarro Roman one, the Bizarre. He was captain of a gang of banditti, whom he governed by his own authority, till he increased them to 1,000 men, both on foot and horseback, whom he maintained in the mountains of Calabria between the French and Neapolitans, both of which he defied and pillaged the country. High rewards were set upon his head to very little purpose, as he took care to guard himself against being betrayed by his own gang, the common fate of those banditti, who become great in their vocation. At length, a French colonel, whose name I have forgot, occupied the country of Bizarro, with such success that he formed a cordon around him and his party, and included him between the folds of a military column. Well nigh driven to submit himself, the robber with his wife, a very handsome woman, and a child of a few months old, took a position beneath the arch of an old bridge, and by an escape almost miraculous were not perceived by a strong party, whom the French maintained on the top of the arch. Night at length came without a discovery, which every moment might have made when it became quite dark. The brigand, enjoining strictest silence on the female and child, resolved to steal from his place of shelter, and as they issued forth kept his hand on the child's throat, but as when they began to move the child naturally cried its father in a rage, stiffened his grip so relentlessly that the poor infant never offended more. In the same manner, this horrid act led to the conclusion of the robber's life. His wife had never been very fond of him, though he trusted her more than any who approached him. She had been originally the wife of another man, murdered by her second husband, which second marriage she was compelled to undergo. And to effect at least the conduct of an affectionate wife in their wanderings, she alone knew, where he slept for the night. He left his men in a body upon the top of an open hill round which they set watches. He then went apart into the woods with his wife, and having chosen a glen obscure and deep thicket of the woods, there took up his residence for the night. A large Calabrian sheepdog, his constant attendant, was then tied to a tree at some distance to secure his slumbers, and having placed his carabine within reach of his lair, he consigned himself to such sleep as belongs to his calling. By such precautions he had secured his rest for many years. But after the death of the child, the measure of his offense towards the unhappy mother was full to the brim, and her thoughts became determined on revenge. One evening, he took up his quarters for the night with these precautions, but without the usual success. He had laid his carabine near him, and betaken himself to rest as usual when his partner arose from his side, and ere he became sensible she had done so, she seized his carabine, and discharging it in his bosom, ended at once his life and crimes. She finished her work by cutting off the brigand's head, and carrying it to the principal town of the province, where she delivered it to the police, and claimed the reward attached to his head, which was paid accordingly. This female still lives, a stately, danger-rouse-looking woman, yet scarce ill thought of considering the provocation. The dog struggled extremely to get loose on hearing the shot. Some say the female shot at others, that in its rage it very nearly gnawed through the stout young tree, to which it was tied. He was worthy of a better master. The distant encampment of the band was disturbed by the firing of the Bizarro's carabine at midnight. They ran through the woods to seek the captain, but finding him lifeless and headless, they became so much surprised that many of them surrendered to the government, and relinquished their trade, and the band of Bizarro, as it lived by his ingenuity, broke up by his death. A story is told nearly as horrible as the above respecting the cruelty of this bandit, which seems to entitle him to be called one of the most odious wretches of his name. A French officer who had been active in the pursuit of him fell into his hands, and was made to die the death of Marcius or Saint Polycarp. That is the period being the middle of summer. He was flayed alive, and being smeared with honey was exposed to all the intolerable insects of a southern sky. The corps were also informed where they might find their officer, if they thought proper to send for him, as more than 2 days elapsed before the wretched man was found. Nothing save his miserable relics could be discovered. I do not warrant these stories, but such are told currently. Tour from Naples to Rome, April 16. Having remained several months at Naples, we resolved to take a tour to Rome during the Holy Week and view the ecclesiastical shows, which take place, although diminished in splendor, by the Pope's poverty. So on the 15th we set out from Naples, my children unwell. We passed through the Champ de Mars, and so on by the Terra di Lavoro, a rich and fertile country, and breakfasted at St. Agatha, a wretched place, but we had a disagreeable experience. I had purchased a traveling carriage, assured that it was English built, and all that. However, when we were half a mile on our journey, a bush started, and a wheel came off, but by dint of contrivances, we fought our way back to Agatha, where we had a miserable lodging and wretched dinner. The people were civil, however, and no bandits abroad, being kept in awe by the escort of the King of Westphalia, who was on his road to Naples. The wheel was effectually repaired, and at 7 in the morning we started with some apprehension of suffering from crossing the very moist marshes called the Pontine Bogs, which lie between Naples and Rome. This is not the time when these exhalations are most dangerous, though they seem to be safe at no time. We remarked the celebrated Capua, which is distinguished into the new and old. The new Capua is on the banks of the river Volturno, which conducts its waters into the moats. It is still a place of some strength in modern war. The approach to the old Capua is obstructed by an ancient bridge of a singular construction, and consists of a number of massive towers half ruined. We did not pass very near to them, but the sight seems very strong. We passed Sinusa or Sessa, an ancient Greek town situated not far from shore. The road from Naples to Capua resembles an orchard on both sides. But alas, it runs through these infernal marshes, which there is no shunning, and which the example of many of my friends proves to be exceeding dangerous. The road, though it has the appearance of winding among hills, is in fact on the left side, limited by the seacoast running northward. It comes into its more proper line at a celebrated sea marsh called Cameria, concerning which the oracle said ne movias Camerinum, and the transgression of which precept brought on a pestilence. The road here is a wild pass bounded by a rocky precipice, on one hand covered with wild shrubs, flowers, and plants, and on the other by the sea. After this, we came to a military position, where Muret used to quarter a body of troops and cannonade the English gunboats, which were not slow in returning the compliment. The English then garrisoned Italy and Sicily under Sir John Stuart. We supped at this place, half fitted up as a barrack, half as an inn. The place is now called Terracina. Near this a round tower is shown, termed the tomb of Cicero, which may be doubted. I ought, before quitting Terracina, to have mentioned the view of the town and castle of Gita. From the pass it is a castle of great strength. I should have mentioned Aversa, remarkable for a house for insane persons, on the humane plan of not agitating their passions. After a long pilgrimage on this beastly road, we fell asleep in spite of warnings to the contrary, and before we beat the reveille were within 20 miles of the city of Rome. I think I felt the effects of the bad air and damp in a very bad headache. After a steep climb up a slippery ill-paved road, Velletri received us and accommodated us in an ancient villa or chateau, the original habitation of an old noble. I would have liked much to have taken a look at it, but I am tired by my ride. I fear my time for such researches is now gone. Monte Albano, a pleasant place, should also be mentioned, especially a forest of grand oaks, which leads you pretty directly into the vicinity of Rome. My son, Charles, had requested the favor of our friend Sir William Gell to bespeak a lodging which, considering his bad health, was scarcely fair. My daughter had imposed the same favor, but they had omitted to give precise direction how to correspond with their friends concerning the execution of their commission. So there we were, as we had reason to think, possessed of 2 apartments, and not knowing the way to any of them, we entered Rome by a gate renovated by one of the old pontiffs, but which I forget, and so paraded the streets by moonlight to discover, if possible, some appearance of the learned Sir William Gell or the pretty Mrs. Ashley. At length we found our old servant, who guided us to the lodgings taken by Sir William Gell, where all was comfortable, a good fire included, which our fatigue and the chilliness of the night required. We dispersed as soon as we had taken some food, wine, and water. We slept reasonably, but on the next morning